So when I was at the lumber mill, I picked up this piece of walnut. I really liked it because it has this cool shape here, a live edge that shows just kind of a rugged look. And I wanted to make a serving tray out of it and really show that off. So I'll be using epoxy on one side of it here, and I'll be making it so that you can see just enough through to see all these details. I don't want to hide all that. And then show off just this beautiful wood right here. So let's get started. The first step in this project was to remove any wood that was chipping off and then smooth it lightly. Not too much though, because I really like the detail. Using the miter saw, I squared up the edge. I decided on melamine for the form. The shiny finish on it helped to keep the epoxy from sticking, which was nice in the whole removal process. I also liked the fact that it was inexpensive. The downside to the melamine is that it was tricky to drill into due to the slick finish on it. I ended up pre-drilling the holes and, yep, broke off a bit in the board. After some unplanned extra work, I was back working on the form again. To help prevent bubbles, I applied quick dry epoxy to the edge that will be against the epoxy. To keep the colored epoxy from staining the wood, I used a shellac on the other edges, the top and the bottom. I could have also used epoxy, however it's just a lot more expensive, so I went with shellac instead. I applied painter's tape on 2 pieces of 2x4 that I will use in clamping down the walnut. The tape helped keep the 2x4s from sticking to it. Epoxy can make a giant mess everywhere if there's just the slightest bit of a hole. So just to make sure I didn't have any gaps, I used caulking on all the interior edges. I used sandpaper to rough up the edge of the walnut so that the epoxy that I poured would adhere to it. I wiped the whole interior of the form with Vaseline, and this will just help me when I'm removing the form so that it will come off more easy. I clamped the piece of walnut in place just so that it won't end up floating up in the epoxy. This is not really an issue, however, the epoxy is so expensive that I try to make sure not to use any excess that I don't have to. I measured out the volume to figure out how much epoxy I would need. Looks like my geometry class finally paid off. I used a 2-part epoxy from EcoPoxy, so I pre-marked the tub just to make sure that I got it exactly right. This stuff can be a little tricky, so I wanted to make sure I had the correct measurements. To give it that nice orange look that I was going for, I used a powder. It can sometimes be hard to see the true depth of the color when looking in, so I ended up using a clear plastic cup, and I would fill it up about an inch or so just to get a more accurate view of how it will look on the cutting board. I brushed the epoxy onto the wood using a paintbrush just to minimize bubbles. I wanted some movement in the epoxy, so I swirled with a brush a few times, and I was very careful not to do it too hard as that can create bubbles. After letting it fully cure for a few days, it was time to take off the form. Now, I did use a pry bar and a hammer to take the form off, and the first time I did this, I was very nervous to do it, but this time I felt a little more comfortable with it. So it's just something you have to be careful with, but it comes off pretty easily as long as you use some sort of mold release. I ran the board through the planer to level the top and bottom. I just cleaned up the edges on the table saw. And just to make sure we're all safe, some followers have been informing me that I should be pushing the wood all the way through on the table saw, which I did not do here. So I will be doing that in the future and make sure that you guys do as well. Using the miter saw, I cleaned up the short edges. I sanded through the grits, starting with 80, and I ended with 600 grit. Off camera, I wet the board after 150 grit, and I let it dry. This will just bring up the wood grain so that the first time you use it, you won't get that rough feeling on your board. I used a jig that I created in a past video to pre-drill the feet holes and get them in the exact spot. Last, I finished up with Odies Oil. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future builds.